As this blistering hot summer moves on beyond the early major releases of the year, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Shadow of the Erdtree, we're past the typical attempt to revitalize E3 with many companies showcasing their most exciting projects for the foreseeable future. Xbox is attempting something of a redemption arc with stuff like Doom the Dark Ages and Gears of War E-Day, which couldn't be timed better given the recent disappointments they've been dealing with. While a lot of people are excited, I still remember how exciting Hi-Fi Rush's announcement and release was, so I'm not holding my breath until Xbox actually puts their money where their mouth is, because right now it seems like they've done nothing but spend money on studio closures. Nintendo's come out of the gate swinging at one final attempt to fill the Switch's library with as many last-second franchise inclusions as possible, with Mario and Luigi Brothership making the transition over from a previous permanent life on exclusive handheld prison. We've also got heavy hitters like a new 2D Zelda game and a first actual look at Metroid Prime 4, finally addressing one of the earliest promises of the Switch's lineup, and becoming one of the longest windows from reveal to release for a Nintendo game. Sony, well, they showed Concord.
Next job is somewhere with less scaffolding.
No scaffolding. Zero scaffolding. I promise.
You fucking...
Lucky for them that they at least have arguably the largest profile release so far this year with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So with all of that out of the way, what game do I want to talk to you about today? Athenian Rhapsody is a crazy little turn-based RPG inspired by the likes of Earthbound and Undertale, with major influence from classic hits from the Game Boy Advance era, like WarioWare and Pokemon. It's a charming game that I enjoyed. The character designs and art were the biggest highlight for me, as well as some of the sprite animations, especially during combat sequences. The game's presentation struck a familiar chord, but lucky for me that I think that the Game Boy Advance was home to some of the most gorgeous sprite art to come from this industry, so it's encouraging to see an indie game that follows in these footsteps. Some of the combat encounters had creative gimmicks inspired by the minigames from WarioWare, but for me, it reminded me of some of the wacky minigames or events you'd have to complete in a Mario Party game. Athenian Rhapsody is full of hidden secrets and characters to discover, too many to even keep track of, so it'll probably scratch the itch for any completionists out there. The solo dev who created the game, Nico Papalia, is also adamant about continual updates and expansions to the game, which is extra icing for anyone who thinks they would enjoy this game. Though it's not without some faults. The biggest issue for me was the narrative, failing to feel cohesive or having a satisfying ending. I think if you approach this game with the expectation of a memorable story, you'll likely be disappointed, and it's a fair expectation given that the story and characters are typically the draw for most turn-based RPGs. While the narrative itself was uneventful, there are some strengths in some of the individual characters you'll meet, and the outrageous number of gags in the game. If you think the game's sense of humor aligns with your own, I imagine you'll have a great time with it. Just be mindful of the difficulty too. There's an optional mode that tones down the difficulty and makes the game more manageable, which I would recommend for many players. A lot of the fights in this game were brutal, with outrageous difficulty spikes in the first half of the game. A challenging boss fight isn't the issue, but given certain limitations and setups, the most difficult fights in the game are loaded in the first half, resulting in a reversed difficulty curve for most of the journey. Overall, I'd say the difficulty spikes were a bit too much for what I figured was supposed to be a more relaxed RPG with a focus on humor and charm. Again, expectations are important to keep in mind. This game isn't designed the way you expect it to, and that surprise can be both a strength and a weakness depending on how you look at it. I was recently away on a trip back home and only brought my Switch with me, so Athenian Rhapsody felt like a great little game to jump into. I was impressed by what I saw at PAX East a few months ago, but it wasn't just this solo dev indie RPG that brought this video on. I also happened to get back into another little indie game that is worth talking about. You don't need to hear any more about Hades that you haven't already heard before. It's one of the best games that came out in 2020, and I've already talked a little about the greatness that Hades has, but I just need to gush. It's probably one of the best action games I've ever played. So many of its components fit so well together that it feels like the result of a decade's worth of work, and in some ways, it is. If you look at the history of Supergiant games, it feels like you can trace the history of Hades all the way through its predecessors, and how each subsequent release from Supergiant led them to all the puzzle pieces fitting together perfectly for Hades. The narrative and characters are so fully realized with masterful writing and some of the best voice acting you'll find in the medium, and sets a new standard for how storytelling can be approached in a choice-driven medium that is only possible with video games. Cinematic linear narratives are perfectly fine, and there are some that I would consider to be masterpieces, like Metal Gear Solid 4, but Hades uses the opportunity that video games offer to deliver a non-linear narrative in a way that feels so fresh and interesting that pushes the boundary for how video game stories can be told. I think this narrative approach should be explored more by different games, and would have loved to have seen something akin to this in bigger games, particularly something like Breath of the Wild, which I think about a lot. Don't get me wrong, I love so many things about Breath of the Wild and its approach to player freedom and creativity, but I think that Hades' approach to narrative storytelling could potentially fit well within Zelda's more open-world, non-linear structure. Maybe it's just wishful thinking though, since Hades' roguelike nature lends itself well to repeat visits with characters and open approach to dialogue, but then I'm left thinking about Majora's Mask and all of the different non-linear side stories that Majora's Mask tells. I think that Hades and Majora's Mask share some DNA with regards to their storytelling and world building, so maybe something like this is possible once again in Zelda's open world future. I'll stop my gushing about Hades for now, but what I'm trying to say is that after playing Athenian Rhapsody and Hades, I'm just left amazed by the inspiration and creativity from great indie games. And even though this E3 delivered some exciting announcements in big AAA franchises, it would feel irresponsible of me to not give a chance to highlight the indie games that are not only pushing this industry in better directions, but that also inspire me to want to realize my own ideas for a game. Even though I'll never have the skill nor the patience to make one, it's a great feeling when you play a game so wonderful that it makes you want to go out and make a game yourself. Another great indie game I'd like to mention is Wylde Flowers, which I didn't play myself, but my wife did, and she gives it a glowing recommendation. Think of a typical social life simulation game like Stardew Valley or Animal Crossing, but where you play as a witch in a small town. What seemed like a typical cozy game actually turned out to be surprisingly dense, with loads of different characters and stories, as well as full voice acting for every single character, which really helps bring the world to life in a way that I don't often see in games of this genre. Don't let the colorful, simple art style fool you. This is a damn good game that I would highly recommend to anyone who may be interested. There's a demo available on Steam if it piques your interest, and it's available on the Switch as well, and thankfully is really well optimized for the console too. Hades is inspirational and developed by a giant team of professionals that are some of the best in the business at what they do. They've been making quality games for the better part of a decade now, but you don't need teams with years of experience to inspire creativity, and Athenian Rhapsody is one of many examples that proves the industry has many talented individuals looking to make their mark and create something special. Indie games are special in a way that can't be replicated by the giant franchises with hundreds of millions of dollars invested in them, because unlike the AAA slop that can feel repetitive and oppressive, indie games encourage me to create more and engage with games in a way that goes beyond just consuming entertainment. A great indie game makes me want to make one myself, and even a mediocre or bad indie game can still offer meaning in the form of an extension of an artist's own desires and experience. You can have a much more interesting experience from a mediocre indie game compared to a mediocre AAA game, because frankly, it's impressive for any indie game to turn out at minimum mediocre. For AAA games, with giant teams and millions of dollars and talented leaders and seniors and developers, you have this expectation of some kind of competency, given the track record and all the safety nets that are in place, even though this isn't necessarily true. AAA games are incredibly difficult to make, with thousands of things that can go wrong, but with that greater production value typically comes higher expectations to meet, even though the greater production value is not at all an indicator of quality. I mean, just look at the biggest Hollywood films that are so ballooned in budgeting and marketing that they require close to $1 billion just to break even, and compare those to something like any lower budget indie film. I can't tell you the amount of incredible films I've seen with a fraction of a budget of a giant Hollywood film. Especially in the case of Athenian Rhapsody, which was primarily done by a single developer, you're being presented with a person's extension of themselves, warts and all. I can criticize aspects like the narrative and pacing of the story, but at the end of the day, I can still appreciate the vision behind what Nico wanted to do for his game, and the aspects he wanted to focus on. Video games are a difficult medium to talk about. Just like a film, there are many technical aspects that can be viewed from a more objective lens. There's artistic vision in all of these choices, but for example, when the sound design of a film is done poorly, and the viewer has difficulty distinguishing important sounds in a film, then that can be seen as an objective mistake rather than a subjective choice, even though one could still argue otherwise. The same applies to video games. There are objective and subjective factors at play, and sometimes it can be hard to determine which is which, but the factors at play for an indie game are more interesting to dissect than a AAA game, because you're watching from a more personal perspective. When I'm playing something like Final Fantasy XVI, the disappointing narrative and pacing of that game is so much more frustrating, because it's the work of hundreds of professionals, with the highest production value you can find in the industry, so the expectations are only that much greater for quality and expertise. Whether or not you consider that a fair mindset, I think it's safe to say that most people would critique a game like Wylde Flowers or Athenian Rhapsody differently than something like Red Dead Redemption 2. Every video game is an extension of the artist that made it, AAA or otherwise, but indie games feel much more personal, and I feel like I have much more personal takeaways from them as opposed to AAA games. I think the greatest thing about art is when it inspires others, and a great indie game can do that for you. So please, after you've played games like the newest Fable or the next 2D Zelda game, play an indie game too. Steam's in the middle of their summer sale right now, so you've got plenty of affordable options. You might be surprised by what you find out of an indie game.
Bullshit. Bullshit. Derivative. That I love. I absolutely love.